We live in a time where we can send robots to Mars and decode the human genome, and yet we still struggle to understand something as immediate and intimate as our own minds. This is the paradox of progress technological evolution outpacing our capacity for self-awareness. But perhaps the next great frontier isn't out there among the stars. It's within us. In the machinery of thought, in the architecture of consciousness, in the electrical pulses that generate identity and intention. Today, something remarkable is happening, not in the headlines, not in the data charts, but in human behavior, subtle, pervasive, undeniable. Some frame it as a spiritual awakening. But let's put aside the metaphors. What we're observing may be described more precisely as a cognitive phase shift, a population-wide increase in attention, perception, and neuroplasticity, driven in part by environmental stressors and global connectivity. Let's look at it as a scientist would, not from belief, from patterns. Across the globe, people are becoming more reflective. Ideas once confined to the philosophical fringe of mindfulness, systems thinking, emotional intelligence are now entering mainstream discourse. That's not magic. That's mimetic evolution. And this shift is accelerating. This is not about prophecy or mysticism. It's about momentum observable, measurable, and real. In biology, adaptation doesn't occur during comfort, it occurs under pressure. Evolution is not a leisurely stroll, it's a response to stress. Species don't shift traits for fun, they do it to survive, or they vanish. Now consider consciousness itself. If the brain is a biological system, an electrochemical organ composed of neurons, synapses, and oscillating waveforms, then it too responds to stimuli. Environmental, social, electromagnetic. Take the sun, for example, not just a ball of plasma in the sky, but a driver of complex energetic systems on Earth. Solar flares and coronal mass ejections have long been known to affect satellite systems, GPS, and even power grids. But could they also interact with the brain's delicate magnetic environment? It's a legitimate question. The human brain operates via electrical signals. Brainwaves are real alpha, beta, gamma oscillations. And the geomagnetic field of Earth, disturbed by solar storms, does modulate those signals, subtly, but statistically. Studies in space, weather, and neuroscience suggest correlations still debated, still being explored between geomagnetic flux and human behavior. Mood disorders, sleep cycles, cognitive disruption. This isn't science fiction, it's geophysics intersecting with neurobiology. So let's ask, if high-energy solar activity can impact Earth's magnetic shield, and if that field, in turn, modulates human biology, then could this environmental pressure be nudging the collective brain, our shared cognition, toward some kind of reorganization? Not ascension as in floating above the clouds, but as in repatterning, as in an emergent system responding to an energetic input. This is how phase transitions work. Water becomes steam, not gradually, but suddenly after absorbing enough heat. The same applies to consciousness. There may be a threshold of saturation point where a population level shift occurs, not from belief, but from cumulative signal. And maybe we're approaching that point. Some call it awakening, some call it chaos. But to a systems scientist, it looks like a critical point of phase of instability that precedes reformation. We've seen this before, not in mysticism, but in nature. Before the avalanche, there is stillness. Before the neural pathway rewires, there is disorientation. Before a society restructures, there is confusion. In physics, this is called a bifurcation point, a fork in the flow of a system where energy accumulates to the point that it can no longer maintain its old pattern. It must shift or fracture. Now, take a step back and observe human civilization, not through headlines, but through data. Never before have we shared so much information so quickly. Never before have institutions lost trust at such a global scale. Never before have more people reported feelings of existential unease, even in relative material comfort. What you're seeing isn't failure, it's friction, a sign that the cognitive architecture, the shared mental model of reality, is being tested by an influx of inputs, data, pressure, complexity. In systems theory, we call this information overload. But overload doesn't always end in breakdown. Sometimes it leads to self-organization when a chaotic system spontaneously forms a new order, more complex, more efficient than the one before. That may be what's happening to us, not because someone planned it, but because enough variables align. Now, let's talk about biology again. The brain isn't static, it's plastic. Neuroplasticity, the ability to rewire itself in response to new experience, extends throughout life. Meditation changes brain structure, novelty expands memory. Purpose lights up prefrontal circuits. If more people engage in conscious, reflective behavior, individually it changes them. But if enough people do it simultaneously, systematically, repeatedly, it doesn't just change individuals. It changes the cultural substrate. The brain has mirror neurons for a reason. We are not islands. We are networks. So perhaps what we're witnessing is not an individual spiritual journey, but a collective cognitive event, a species-level shift in how we process time, self, morality, and reality. Not magic, not mysticism, but emergent complexity. We are, in effect, undergoing a software upgrade. In quantum physics, there is a phenomenon called the observer effect, where the mere act of measuring a system alters its outcome. Subatomic particles, before being observed, exist not as defined objects, but as probability fields, a spectrum of potential states. It's only when we observe, that these potentials collapse into a singular, measurable reality. Now, extrapolate that metaphor beyond particles. What if awareness, at every scale, exerts subtle pressure on systems, social systems, emotional dynamics, even technological adoption? What if the act of attention is not passive, but participatory? This is not a mystical claim. It is a question about the power of human focus. When millions of people simultaneously direct their attention toward wellness, toward reflection, toward connection, when algorithms reinforce that behavior, when literature and science legitimize it, what happens? Social change accelerates. Trends become norms. Ideas become policies. Meditation, once fringe, becomes mainstream. Emotional literacy becomes part of educational curricula. Sustainability becomes embedded in business strategy. This is mimetic evolution, the evolution of ideas, not genes. And it happens faster because ideas don't wait for generations. They ride networks. They mutate with language. And when they resonate with enough people, they catalyze action. In this view, what some call ascension is better understood as cognitive convergence, the alignment of mental models across populations, enabling collective intelligence to emerge. It's not esoteric. It's pattern recognition. Now, if we bring astrophysics back into the picture, something poetic emerges. We live on a planet orbiting a G-type main sequence star. That star bombards our planet with radiation light, heat, solar wind. It shapes our climate, drives our seasons, powers photosynthesis, and defines our biological rhythms. But it may also affect our perception. There is growing interest in biophysics, in chronobiology, about how solar cycles may influence human biology. Some studies hint that geomagnetic activity correlates with fluctuations in serotonin and melatonin levels chemicals that modulate mood, sleep, and cognition. It's still early, the data is noisy, but it invites a hypothesis. If our consciousness, our very sense of awareness, is encoded in a bioelectrical system, and if that system is nested within a planetary electromagnetic field, which is in turn modulated by solar output, then our minds may be more cosmically entangled than we realize. Again, this doesn't mean the sun is awakening us. It means that external cosmic phenomena may serve as background pressure, a kind of environmental rhythm to which our biology and perhaps our collective cognition subtly entrains. The sun pulses, Earth responds, and maybe, in some small but non-negligible way, so do we. Not mysticism, mechanism. When we observe ancient civilizations, one thing becomes clear. No system persists indefinitely. Whether ecological, political, or economic, Every structure reaches a point where the complexity it once managed becomes the very weight that brings it down. We are not exempt from this principle. The institutions of today, governments, financial models, education systems, were designed for a different era. They were constructed in a world of paper, scarcity, and slowness. But we now live in a world of algorithms, abundance, and acceleration. That mismatch creates friction. And friction in physics creates heat. So when people say everything feels like it's falling apart, they're not wrong, but perhaps that's the wrong metaphor. Things aren't falling apart. They're reaching critical mass. In thermodynamics, we observe a concept called latent heat, the invisible energy, absorbed by a system during a phase transition, like when ice melts into water. During that change, temperature remains constant. Even though energy is pouring in, nothing appears to happen until suddenly everything changes. Now, imagine humanity as the system. The protests, the polarization, the institutional mistrust, they're not failures, they're signals. Energy is building, tension is accumulating, not chaotically, but systemically. We are absorbing latent heat. That's why so much feels uncertain, why the old rules no longer apply. Because we're in the interregnum, the in-between space where the past no longer explains the present and the future hasn't stabilized. Historian Arnold Toynbee once observed that civilizations die not from murder, but from suicide. That is, they fail to adapt. But adaptation is not just biological, it's cognitive, it's emotional, it's technological, it's ethical. And all of those realms are now entangled. So when ancient belief systems begin to fracture, when cultural assumptions no longer hold, when traditional success metrics ring hollow, it may not be decline. It may be transition. Not the end of the world, but the end of a model of the world. And the question we face isn't how do we stop the collapse? It's what do we build next? Change, especially internal change, is not always graceful. In fact, from the perspective of the brain, transformation can feel like threat. The brain is a prediction machine wired to recognize patterns, avoid risk, and conserve energy. Anything that disrupts those predictions, new ideas, unfamiliar feelings, conflicting value triggers, resistance. But here's what modern neuroscience has revealed. Resistance is often the first sign of neuroplasticity. It means the circuitry is loosening. The old pathway scarred by years of repetition, trauma, or conditioning gear being challenged, not erased, but rewritten. This isn't a spiritual metaphor. It's biology. Functional MRI studies have shown that mindfulness practices increase activity in the prefrontal cortexes associated with awareness and decision-making, and decrease activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center. Long-term meditation changes the density of gray matter. Trauma therapy alters neural connectivity. Empathy is not just a feeling, it's a signal transmitted through mirror neurons in vagal tone. In short, how we think, feel, and relate is not fixed. It's malleable and it can be trained. So what some traditions have called shadow work or integration might better be described as emotional recalibration, a process in which buried responses are brought into awareness, regulated through attention, and reorganized through repetition. You don't need mysticism to explain that. You need synaptic pruning and myelination. And here's the fascinating part. As individuals begin this work, communities follow. Behavior spreads through social contagion. The more people engage in reflective practices, journaling, therapy, self-inquiry, the more those behaviors normalize. The more they normalize, the more infrastructure forms around them. Apps, curricula, wellness programs, national policies. This is feedback-driven adaptation. So the surge in meditation, the popularity of breath work, the growing openness to mental health conversations, these aren't spiritual revolutions, they're behavioral tipping points. And they're how complex systems evolve without collapse. But here's the deeper insight. All of this is happening simultaneously. Cognitive reorganization, technological acceleration, environmental instability, social reinvention. It's not coincidence, It's convergence. And when convergence reaches a threshold, when enough variables align, you don't just get more of the same, you get emergence, novelty, the appearance of a new pattern that couldn't be predicted from the sum of its parts. In complexity science, we call this a phase transition. In human terms, we might simply call it awakening. The idea that transformation requires departure, that we must rise above the world to evolve is a persistent myth. But in nature, evolution rarely moves away. It moves through. Organisms don't transcend ecosystems, they adapt within them. They specialize. They become more attuned to their niche, not less. The hummingbird doesn't leave the flower. It becomes part of its reproductive cycle. The mycelium doesn't abandon the forest floor, it is the forest nervous system. So why do we assume that human progress means leaving the planet or abandoning the body? The truth may be simpler. We are not meant to escape Earth. We are meant to finally understand our place within it. Consider this. Earth is not just soil and stone. It's a self-regulating system and interplay of geochemical, biological, and atmospheric feedback loops. What James Lovelock termed the Gaia hypothesis suggests that life interacts with the environment to maintain conditions favorable to life. This isn't mysticism, it's observable science. Earth has feedback mechanisms, carbon cycles, ocean currents, temperature regulation, even forest communication through mycorrhizal networks. And now enter humanity, a species with symbolic language, with tools, with nuclear power, and with the ability to destroy or preserve entire ecosystems with a keystroke. In this context, consciousness isn't the anomaly, it's the next layer of planetary feedback. The brain of Earth, not because we are superior, but because we are self-aware. And with self-awareness comes responsibility. This is what some traditions called awakening. But you don't need mysticism to grasp it. You need ecological systems thinking. If Earth is evolving chemically, biologically, thermodynamically, then perhaps the emergence of reflective consciousness is not an accident, but a phase, a signal that the planet is entering a new state of complexity, one in which its most advanced subsystem uses finally becoming aware of its role, not as rulers, but as participants. And as with any system approaching complexity, coherence becomes key. In physics, coherent systems resonate, lasers, crystals, even flocking birds. In social science, coherence shows up as shared values, distributed intelligence, collective purpose. So perhaps what we're seeing isn't an ascension away from matter, but a resonance within it, a tuning of human minds, behaviors, and structures to the deeper frequencies of planetary order. That's not fantasy, that's feedback. People often speak of the veil thinning, of moments when reality seems permeable, when thoughts feel faster, dreams feel vivid, coincidences feel too precise. Science doesn't ignore this. It simply asks, what mechanisms might explain it? Let's start with the brain. Your brain is not a passive recorder of reality. It is a prediction engine. Every millisecond, it forecasts what it expects to perceive and then compares incoming data to that model. What you experience as now is in fact a composite image part sensory input, part expectation. And sometimes when external stimuli align unusually well with internal patterns, we experience cognitive resonance. We call it synchronicity. But in the language of neuroscience, it's a moment of predictive compression where the boundary between thought and environment blurs. Not because of magic, but because your mind anticipated a pattern and reality confirmed it. This leads us to another point. Time is not linear in the way we intuitively believe. In physics, especially in relativistic models, time is a coordinate, not a universal constant. And in quantum mechanics, particles interact across time via entanglemento phenomenon that allows two particles, once linked, to influence each other regardless of distance. Even more intriguingly, certain interpretations, like Wheeler's delayed choice experiment, suggest that present observations can influence the past paths of quantum events. Now, apply that concept metaphorically, not mystically, to cognition. What if consciousness, like light, is sensitive to configuration? What if thoughts, decisions, and insights aren't isolated blips in a stream, but probability clouds with future potentials influencing present perceptions? This doesn't mean fate. It means entangled feedback where the act of observing your life with intention subtly reorganizes the probabilities you're likely to encounter. That's not mysticism, that's Bayesian inference. And the more coherent your internal state, your beliefs, your biology, your behaviors, the more clearly you perceive those patterns. Not because the world changed, but because your cognitive aperture widened, you tuned the signal, reduced the noise. Which brings us to the language of frequency. It's tempting to write off such terms as spiritual jargon. But from a scientific standpoint, frequency is simply repetition over time. Your heartbeat has a frequency. Your brain waves, your sleep cycles, your hormonal pulses, your behavioral routines, your speech patterns. When we say someone is operating at a higher frequency, what might that mean biologically? It could mean greater cognitive coherence of brain with stable rhythms, higher integration between hemispheres, and more efficient information processing. It could mean emotional regulation, greater heart rate variability, lower cortisol, synchronized neural oscillations with others. These aren't metaphors. These are metrics. So yes, something is shifting, not because a veil is lifting, but because more humans are synchronizing their attention, aligning their behaviors, and choosing perception over reaction. And once you shift perception, everything else follows. In scientific discourse, there's often hesitation to talk about love. Not because it lacks importance, but because it defies reduction. It's difficult to quantify, to model, to contain. But that doesn't mean it can't be observed. Love defined biologically is not an abstraction. It's a neurochemical cascade. Oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin. It modulates heart rhythms. It enhances immune function. It drives social bonding, which increases species survival. But more than that, love introduces coherence into systems. In physics, coherence is when parts of a system operate in phase predictably, harmoniously. In lasers, coherence allows photons to align and concentrate into powerful beams. In brains, it shows up as synchronized neural oscillations. In ecosystems, it manifests as symbiosis. In human relationships, coherence emerges as empathy. Empathy is not mystical, it is measurable. Functional MRI scans reveal that when you witness someone in pain, your brain lights up in the same regions as theirs. This mirroring effect, driven by mirror neurons, creates a shared experience of reality. And when individuals synchronize in this way, groups become more intelligent. Collective IQ rises, conflict declines, collaboration increases. So when we say love is the highest frequency, what might that mean? It might mean that love is the most coherent state available to a social species estate that allows for information to flow freely, for biology to stabilize, for behavior to align with long-term sustainability rather than short-term gain. In chaos theory, a single coherent node can entrain an entire field. A metronome, properly placed, can cause others to synchronize. One heart in resonance can regulate a room. That's not sentiment, that's resonance dynamics. It explains why compassion isn't weakness, it's strategy. Why gentleness isn't passivity, it's precision. Why presence is not just polite, it's powerful. Because the human nervous system, like any oscillator, responds to stability. And in an unstable world, a coherent human being becomes a force multiplier. So if more people begin to operate from this place not as a performance, but as a biological baseline, we will see changes. Not mystical ones, observable ones. Heart rate variability improves. Inflammatory markers drop. Collective decision-making becomes less reactive. Conflict resolution becomes more adaptive. This is how systems self-organize toward higher function. It's not magic. It's physics, chemistry, and biology working in harmony. When people ask what happens next, they often expect an event A flash in the sky? A sudden awakening? A finish line? But the cosmos doesn't operate that way. In astrophysics, change is rarely explosive. More often, it's gradual until it's irreversible. Galaxies collide over millions of years. Stars burn for billions before collapsing or transforming. Even black holes, those enigmatic engines of gravity, don't consume everything instantly. They curve space silently, patiently. Evolution cosmic or cognitivus, not a spectacle. It's a process. And so is what we're experiencing now. If we've entered a stage of collective transformation, it won't be marked by fireworks. It will be marked by subtle but sustained shifts in values, in behavior, in the systems we choose to uphold or abandon. We will measure success not by accumulation, but by contribution. We will design cities not for efficiency alone, but for mental well-being. We will educate for curiosity, not just compliance. We will begin to treat ecosystems not as resources, but as relationships. And these aren't utopian fantasies. These are the next logical adaptations of a species that suddenly realizes its tools have outpaced its wisdom. The human brain, once optimized for survival on the savannah, now pilots spacecraft and manipulates genomes. The question is no longer, can we do it? It's should we? And that question belongs to the realm of ethics, awareness, and intention. In short, to consciousness itself, which brings us full circle. Consciousness is not a byproduct. It's an emergent property. It's what happens when matter begins to reflect on itself, when atoms organize into neurons, and neurons into thoughts, and thoughts into civilizations. You are part of that emergence. You are the way the universe contemplates it, not metaphorically, but literally. Your senses are starborn. Your DNA is forged from ancient supernovae. The iron in your blood, the calcium in your bones, the carbon in your breath, it all comes from stars that died to make you possible. And now, those elements think, they build telescopes. They question their own origin. They wonder what it all means. That is not mystical. That is extraordinary. So what is ascension in this context? Not rising above the world, but becoming more rooted in it, more aware, more precise, more connected to the feedback loops that sustain life, more accountable to the systems we've built and the ones we must now repair or replace. In other words, maturity. The next step in our evolution may not be physical. It may be perceptual. A new lens through which to view ourselves not as masters of Earth, but as extensions of it. As participants in a planetary intelligence, we're only beginning to understand. And yes, some will resist. Institutions will drag their feet. The human egoso, used to control, will protest the loss of dominance. But evolution doesn't wait for consensus. It responds to pressure. And the pressure is building. This is not the end of the world. It's the beginning of a new kind of world, a world built not on denial, but on data. Not on superstition, but on science. Not on fear, but on curiosity. So if you feel something stirring within you, an urgency, a discontent, a hunger for something deeper, don't dismiss it. That's not your imagination. That's you adapting. That's the signal of a brain end, a species that is beginning to realize we are not here to escape the cosmos. We are here to understand it. And through that understanding, to evolve